The woman in the faded calico dress stumbled into Angel's Camp, California on a scorching August afternoon in 1867. Her feet wrapped in burlap because she had no shoes left to wear. And Jacob Whitmore noticed her before anyone else did because he had been coming down from his mountain cabin to trade pelts and hadn't seen another soul in 3 weeks. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that caught the sunlight, and his arms were thick with muscle from years of hauling timber and trapping in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The woman looked like she might collapse any second, her dress so worn that the original blue pattern had faded to a ghostly gray, the hem torn and mended so many times with mismatched thread that it looked like a patchwork of desperation. Jacob dropped the bundle of beaver pelts he had been carrying and moved toward her just as her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the dusty street, his strong arms cradling her light frame as if she weighed nothing at all. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing the most striking green he had ever seen, like spring grass after rain, and she tried to speak but only a cracked whisper emerged. "Water," she managed to say. He carried her to the nearest building, which happened to be the general store owned by Martha Henderson, a plump woman in her 50s who took one look at the girl in his arms and immediately started fussing. Martha brought water and a damp cloth while Jacob laid the woman down on a bench in the shade of the store's porch. "Who is she?" Martha asked, dabbing the woman's forehead with the cloth. "Don't know," Jacob said, kneeling beside the bench. "Just saw her walking into town and then she started falling." The woman's eyes opened again, and she looked between them with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I am sorry," she said, her voice still weak. "I have been walking for 2 days without much water. I did not mean to cause trouble." "What is your name, dear?" Martha asked gently. "Victoria Brooks," the woman said, trying to sit up. Jacob placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, keeping her down. "Stay put until you get some strength back," he said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse since he spent most of his time alone in the mountains, but not unkind. Victoria looked at him properly then, taking in his sun-bronzed face, the beard that covered his strong jaw, and those eyes that were a peculiar shade of blue-gray like storm clouds over the mountains. Something flickered in her expression, but she nodded and lay back down. Martha brought bread and cheese along with more water, and Victoria ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had not had a proper meal in quite some time. Jacob found himself watching her, noting the delicate bones of her wrists, the way her blonde hair had been pinned back but was coming loose in wisps around her face, and most of all, that dress that looked like it had seen better days several years ago. "Where are you coming from?" Martha asked as Victoria finished eating. Victoria's face clouded over. "Sacramento. I was working as a seamstress there, but the woman I worked for passed away 3 months ago. Her son sold the business and I lost my position. I have been trying to find work since then, but there was nothing. I heard there might be opportunities here in the mining towns, sewing for miners who need their clothes mended." "You are a seamstress?" Jacob asked, and something in his tone made Victoria look at him quickly. "Yes, though you would not know it to look at me now," she said with a bitter little laugh, gesturing at her dress. "I have been wearing this same dress for almost 3 years. Everything I owned was sold to pay for food and lodging when I could not find steady work. I kept my sewing scissors and a few needles, thinking I would need them for work, but I never had enough money left over to buy fabric for myself." The admission seemed to cost her something, and she looked away, her cheeks flushing with shame. Jacob felt something tighten in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that he did not quite understand. He spent most of his time alone in the mountains, trapping and hunting, coming to town only when he needed supplies or had goods to trade. He was not accustomed to feeling protective of anyone except himself, but looking at this fragile woman in her threadbare dress, he felt a fierce urge to help her. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over," Martha said. "Mrs. Cooper runs it, and she is always looking for help. You could work there in exchange for room and board while you build up a sewing business." "That would be wonderful," Victoria said, sitting up slowly this time. "Thank you for your kindness, both of you." Jacob stood, towering over both women. "I will take her to Mrs. Cooper's," he said. It was not a question. Martha raised her eyebrows but nodded. "That would be helpful. I need to mind the store." Jacob helped Victoria to her feet, keeping a hand under her elbow to steady her. She swayed slightly but managed to stay upright. They walked slowly through the dusty streets of Angel's Camp, past the saloons and gambling halls that catered to the miners who still searched for gold in the nearby hills, though the rush had died down considerably since the early 50s. Victoria kept her head down, clearly embarrassed by her appearance, but Jacob noticed more than one miner stop and stare at her with interest. He found himself moving slightly closer to her, his presence a clear warning to anyone who might get ideas. Mrs. Cooper turned out to be a thin, severe-looking woman in her 60s, but her eyes were kind when she looked at Victoria. "Martha sent word you were coming," she said, which surprised Jacob since they had just left the general store. Then he saw the young boy standing behind Mrs. Cooper and realized Martha must have sent her son running ahead. "I can offer you a small room under the eaves in exchange for helping with cooking and cleaning," Mrs. Cooper said. "And if you can sew, there is plenty of mending work. These miners tear their clothes faster than you can fix them." "I would be grateful for the work," Victoria said. Mrs. Cooper nodded and led them inside. The boarding house was clean and well-maintained, smelling of lye soap and something cooking in the kitchen. The room she showed Victoria was small, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a window that let in light and it was clean. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Mrs. Cooper patted her arm. "You look like you could use a rest. I will bring you some stew in a bit. Tomorrow will be soon enough to start working." Jacob stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. He felt awkward suddenly, unsure why he was still there. Victoria turned to him and smiled, a real smile that transformed her tired face into something beautiful. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." "Jacob," he said. "Just Jacob." "Jacob," she repeated, and he liked the way his name sounded in her soft voice. "Thank you, Jacob." He nodded and left, his mind churning with thoughts he could not quite sort out. He went back to the general store to collect his pelts and conduct his business with the trader who bought his furs. But through all of it, he kept thinking about Victoria in that worn dress, about the way she had tried to maintain her dignity, even when she was clearly at the end of her resources. That evening, Jacob did something he had never done before. Instead of getting his supplies and heading straight back to his cabin in the mountains, he stayed in town, renting a room at the other boarding house. He told himself it was because it was getting late and he might as well start fresh in the morning, but the truth was he wanted to make sure Victoria was all right. The next morning, he found himself walking past Mrs. Cooper's boarding house on his way to the general store. He saw Victoria through the window, already up and working, sweeping the front porch. She had changed into a different dress, but it was just as worn as the first one, a faded brown thing that hung on her thin frame. She saw him and waved, and he touched the brim of his hat in return. At the general store, Martha was arranging bolts of fabric on a shelf. Jacob had never paid much attention to fabric before. He wore the same few shirts and trousers until they were beyond repair, then bought new ones already made. But now he found himself looking at the fabrics, seeing the different colors and patterns. "Looking for something special?" Martha asked, noting his interest. "How much fabric would it take to make a dress?" he asked. Martha's eyes widened slightly, but she was too polite to comment. "Depends on the style, but usually about 5 to 6 yards. Why do you ask?" Jacob ran his hand over a bolt of blue cotton, a rich color like a summer sky. "Just wondering. That blue would bring out someone's green eyes beautifully," Martha said carefully. "And it is good quality, would last for years with proper care." Jacob looked at her and saw the knowing expression on her face. He cleared his throat. "I will take 8 yards of that, and some thread to match." 8 yards. Enough for 2 dresses, he said firmly. Martha smiled and began measuring out the fabric. "Will you be needing anything else? Some ribbon perhaps, or buttons?" Jacob felt out of his depth. "What would be needed to make proper dresses?" Martha patted his arm. "Let me put together what would be useful. Buttons, thread, maybe some lace for trim. Nothing too fancy, but nice." While she gathered the items, Jacob tried to calculate what this was going to cost him. He had done well with his trapping last winter and had a good amount of money saved, but this was still a significant purchase. He thought about Victoria's face when she had admitted to wearing the same dress for 3 years, the shame and resignation in her voice, and he knew he was going to buy the fabric no matter what it cost. Martha wrapped everything carefully in brown paper and tied it with string. "That will be $12 even." Jacob counted out the money without hesitation. Then he stood there, holding the package, suddenly unsure what to do next. He could not just show up and hand it to Victoria. She would probably be offended, thinking it was charity or worse, that he expected something in return. "You could leave it with me," Martha suggested gently. "I could say it was donated to the church and they wanted it to go to someone who could use it. Mrs. Cooper could pass it along." "Would she believe that?" Jacob asked doubtfully. "Probably not," Martha admitted, "but it would give her a way to accept it without feeling beholden to anyone specifically." Jacob nodded slowly. "All right, do that." He left the package with Martha and walked out of the store, heading toward the edge of town where his horse was stabled. He should go back to his cabin. He had been away too long already, and there were traps to check and wood to split before winter. But his feet seemed to have other ideas, and he found himself walking back toward Mrs. Cooper's boarding house. Victoria was hanging laundry in the yard behind the house, her arms raised to pin a sheet to the line. Even in that worn brown dress, even tired and thin as she was, there was something about her that drew him. Maybe it was the determined set of her shoulders, the way she kept working despite everything she had been through. Maybe it was the glimpse he had caught of her spirit, still intact despite her hardships. "Jacob," she said, surprised to see him, "I thought you would have gone back to the mountains by now." "Planning to head out soon," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you were settling in all right." She smiled, pushing a loose strand of hair back from her face. "Mrs. Cooper has been very kind. I already have 3 mending jobs from miners who board here. It is a start." "That is good," he said, then stood there awkwardly, not sure what else to say. "Would you like some coffee?" Victoria asked. "Mrs. Cooper just made a fresh pot." He should say no. He should get on his horse and ride back to his cabin and forget about the woman with green eyes and a worn dress. Instead, he said, that would be nice. They sat on the back porch, drinking coffee that was strong and hot. Victoria asked him about his life in the mountains, and Jacob found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about his cabin, about trapping beaver and fox, about the long, silent winters when snow piled up to the windows, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional cry of an eagle. "It sounds lonely," Victoria said softly. "It is," he admitted, "but peaceful too. No one to answer to, no one to disappoint." "Who would you disappoint?" she asked, her green eyes curious. Jacob looked down at his coffee. "My parents wanted me to stay and work the farm in Missouri. They thought I was crazy to come west to live alone in the mountains. Maybe they were right." "I do not think you are crazy," Victoria said. "I think you are brave. It takes courage to live the life you want instead of the life others expect from you." Something in her tone made him look up. "Is that what you did? Choosing to be a seamstress?" She laughed, but it was a sad sound. "Not exactly. My father died when I was 15. My mother tried to keep the house in San Francisco, but she could not manage it alone. She remarried a year later to a man who made it clear that I was not welcome in his home. My mother's employer, a dressmaker, offered to take me on as an apprentice. It was the only option I had." "What happened to your mother?" Jacob asked. "She died 2 years ago. Influenza. Her husband did not even send word until a month after she was buried." Victoria's voice was flat, but Jacob could hear the pain underneath. "I am sorry," he said. She shrugged, but he could see the shimmer of tears in her eyes. "I survived. I learned to sew and I was good at it. I thought I would always have that, at least. But then Mrs. Patterson died and everything fell apart." Jacob wanted to reach out and take her hand to offer some kind of comfort, but he did not know if it would be welcome. He was not good at these things, at knowing what to say or do to make someone feel better. "You will build it back up," he said finally. "You are strong. I can see that." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them, some recognition or understanding that made Jacob's heart beat faster. "I should get back to work," she said, standing up. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation." "Thank you," he said, standing as well. He towered over her, and she had to tilt her head back to look at him. For a moment, they just stood there, and Jacob had the wild impulse to pull her into his arms, to promise her that everything would be all right. But he did not. Instead, he put his hat back on and said, "I will be back in town in a few weeks, to trade more pelts." "I hope I will see you then," Victoria said. Jacob rode out of Angel's camp an hour later, but his mind was not on the mountain trails or the traps he needed to check. It was on a woman with green eyes who had been wearing the same dress for 3 years and refused to let life break her spirit. 3 days later, Martha brought the package of fabric to Mrs. Cooper's boarding house with the story about the church donation. Victoria was suspicious at first. Martha told Jacob when he came back to town 2 weeks later, but she had eventually accepted it with tears of gratitude. Mrs. Cooper had given her time to work on dresses for herself, and Victoria had stayed up late 3 nights in a row, sewing by lamplight. Jacob heard all this from Martha, but did not go to see Victoria right away. He sold his pelts, bought his supplies, and was preparing to leave town when Mrs. Cooper found him. "Victoria wanted me to thank whoever donated that fabric," she said, her sharp eyes studying him carefully. "She made herself 2 beautiful dresses and has enough left over for a skirt and blouse." "That is good to hear," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "She also said she wished she could thank them in person," Mrs. Cooper continued. "She has been asking around town, trying to figure out who it was." Jacob shifted uncomfortably. "It was supposed to be anonymous." "Was it?" Mrs. Cooper asked, and there was a knowing tone in her voice that told Jacob his secret was not as secret as he had hoped. "Well, anonymous or not, that girl is over the moon. First time I have seen her really smile since she got here. You should come by for dinner tonight before you head back to the mountains. I am making pot roast." Jacob knew he should refuse. He had already spent too much time thinking about Victoria, and getting more involved would only make it harder to return to his solitary life. But he found himself nodding. "What time?" 6 o'clock. Mrs. Cooper said, and walked away with a satisfied smile. Jacob spent the afternoon trying to convince himself to ride out of town and skip dinner. But when 6 o'clock came, he was standing on Mrs. Cooper's front porch, his hair still damp from washing it in the horse trough, wearing his cleanest shirt. Victoria answered the door, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing one of the new dresses, a blue cotton that matched the fabric he had bought. It fit her properly, showing that she had a woman's figure beneath the worn clothes she had been wearing. Her blonde hair was pinned up neatly, and her green eyes were bright with health and happiness. She looked beautiful. "Jacob," she said, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Mrs. Cooper said you might come. Please come in." Dinner was a lively affair with 8 miners who boarded at the house, all of them trying to engage Victoria in conversation and show off for her. Jacob sat quietly, eating the excellent pot roast and watching Victoria laugh at their stories. He noticed that she was kind but kept a polite distance from all of them, not encouraging any particular attention. After dinner, Victoria asked if he would like to sit on the porch for a while, and he agreed readily. The evening was warm, the sun setting behind the hills and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Your dress is very nice," Jacob said, feeling foolish the moment the words left his mouth, but Victoria smiled and ran her hands over the fabric. "Thank you. It is the most beautiful thing I have owned in years. I still cannot believe someone would donate such lovely fabric." Jacob looked away, afraid his face would give him away. Whoever it was probably just wanted to help. "I know," Victoria said softly, "but it means more than just the fabric. It means someone saw me and cared enough to do something kind without expecting anything in return. That is rare." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night. Finally, Victoria said, "Will you be gone long this time?" "Probably a month," Jacob said. "Maybe longer, depends on how the trapping goes." "I will miss our conversations," Victoria said, and there was something in her voice that made Jacob look at her sharply. "Will you?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Yes. You are the only person here who talks to me like I am a real person, not just a poor, unfortunate girl who needs charity or a pretty face to flirt with." Jacob felt his chest tighten. "You are a real person, a strong, capable person who has survived things that would have broken someone weaker." Victoria's eyes shimmered with tears. "Thank you for saying that." Before he could think better of it, Jacob reached out and took her hand. It was small and delicate in his large, calloused palm, but he could feel the roughness of her fingertips from years of sewing. "It is the truth," he said. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it over and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that, hands clasped, until full dark fell and Mrs. Cooper called Victoria inside to help with the evening chores. Jacob rode back to his cabin the next morning with his mind in turmoil. He had never felt this way about anyone before, this combination of protectiveness and desire, and something deeper that he could not name. He tried to lose himself in work, checking his trap lines, hunting for meat, splitting wood for the winter. But every night he lay in his bed and thought about Victoria in her blue dress, about the way she had held his hand, about the smile that lit up her face when she was happy. A month passed, then 6 weeks. Jacob told himself he was staying away because he had work to do, but the truth was he was afraid. Afraid of what he was feeling, afraid of disrupting the life he had built, afraid of being hurt or causing hurt. Finally, in late October, he loaded up his pelts and rode back to Angel's camp. His heart was pounding as he came down the main street, and he found himself looking for Victoria everywhere. He did not see her at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house or at the general store. Finally, he asked Martha if she had seen her. "Oh," Victoria moved, Martha said. About 2 weeks ago, she has been doing so well with her sewing business that she was able to rent the little house behind the church. She turned the front room into a proper sewing shop. Jacob felt a rush of pride mixed with disappointment. "That is wonderful," he said, meaning it. "You should go see her," Martha said pointedly. "I am sure she would be happy to know you are in town." Jacob sold his pelts first, partly because he needed to conduct his business and partly because he needed time to work up his nerve. Finally, as the sun was starting to set, he walked to the little house behind the church. It was a small white building with a neat garden in front and a sign in the window that read "Seamstress Mending and Alterations." Through the window, he could see Victoria bent over her work, sewing by the light of several lamps. She looked peaceful, content, and Jacob hesitated, wondering if he should interrupt her. But then she looked up and saw him, and her face transformed with joy. She dropped her sewing and ran to the door, throwing it open. "Jacob," she said, "you are back." "I am back," he confirmed, drinking in the sight of her. She was wearing the other dress she had made, a soft green that matched her eyes, and she looked healthy and happy. Come in," she said, pulling him inside. "I have so much to tell you. Look at this." She gestured around the room, which was set up as a proper sewing shop with a large work table, a dress form, and shelves holding fabric and thread and all manner of sewing supplies. "I have been so busy, I can barely keep up with all the work. And I have started making dresses to sell, not just doing mending. 3 women have already ordered new dresses from me." "This is wonderful," Jacob said, and he meant it, even though part of him felt suddenly unsure of his place in her new, successful life. "It is all because of that fabric someone donated," Victoria said, her eyes bright. "Those first 2 dresses showed people that I could do quality work, and then I used the money I earned to buy more fabric and supplies. It gave me a start when I desperately needed one." Jacob shifted uncomfortably. "I am glad it helped." Victoria looked at him carefully. "Jacob, everyone in town seems to know that you were the one who bought that fabric for me. Everyone except me, apparently, until Mrs. Cooper finally told me last week." Jacob felt his face heat. "I just wanted to help. You are a seamstress who needed fabric. It made sense." "It was 8 yards of the most expensive fabric in the store, plus thread and buttons and trim," Victoria said softly. "That was not just helping. That was extraordinarily generous." "You needed it," Jacob said stubbornly. Victoria crossed the room until she was standing right in front of him, so close he could smell the lavender water she wore. "Why did you do it?" Jacob looked down at her, at those green eyes that seemed to see right through him. He could lie, make up some excuse, but he was tired of being afraid. "Because I could not stand seeing you in that worn-out dress, working so hard and having nothing for yourself. Because you deserved something beautiful. Because I wanted to do something for you." "Why?" Victoria asked again, even more softly. "Because I care about you," Jacob said, the words coming out rough and honest. "Because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the day I caught you in the street. Because you have gotten under my skin in a way no one ever has before." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I was so afraid you had forgotten about me. You were gone so long, and I thought maybe you regretted being kind to me, that you were staying away on purpose." "Never," Jacob said fiercely. "I stayed away because I was scared. Scared of feeling this much. I have been alone for so long, I do not know how to be any other way." "Then learn," Victoria said, reaching up to touch his bearded face. "Learn with me. Because I have been alone too, and I am tired of it. I am tired of being scared and protecting myself. I want to live, Jacob, and I want to live with you." Jacob pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, fitting against his large frame as if she had been made to be there. He kissed her then, and it was everything he had been denying himself for weeks. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have much to offer," he said. "Just a cabin in the mountains and a hard life." "That sounds perfect to me," Victoria said. "But I have my business now. I cannot just leave it." Jacob had not thought of that. "No, of course not. You have worked hard for this." "Maybe we could work something out," Victoria said thoughtfully. "I could keep the shop and you could come to town more often. Or we could find a way to combine our lives. I do not know exactly how, but I know I do not want to lose you." "You will not lose me," Jacob promised. "We will figure it out together." Over the next few weeks, they did exactly that. Jacob found himself spending more time in town than he ever had before, helping Victoria with repairs on her little house, carrying heavy bolts of fabric from the general store, and simply being near her whenever he could. In return, Victoria came up to his cabin in the mountains for a weekend, riding behind him on his horse, and saw the life he lived there. She loved it. She loved the quiet and the peace, the way the mountains rose up all around them, the crystal-clear creek that ran behind his cabin. She loved watching Jacob chop wood, the muscles in his back and arms flexing with each swing of the axe. She loved the simple meals they cooked together, and the way he would pull her into his lap in the evening and they would sit by the fire, talking or simply being together. "I could sew here," Victoria said one evening. "I could bring my work up here and sew by the window. The light is beautiful." "What about your shop?" Jacob asked, running his fingers through her blonde hair, which she had left down and hung in waves past her shoulders. "I could keep it, work there part of the week and be here the rest of the time," Victoria said. "Or I could close the shop and just take commissions, things I could work on anywhere. There are options." "You love that shop," Jacob said. "I do not want you to give it up for me." Victoria turned in his lap to face him. "I love you more," she said simply. "The shop is wonderful, but it is just a place. You are my home." Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked up tight for years. "I love you too," he said, the words feeling strange but right on his tongue. "More than I thought I could love anyone." They were married in December, in the little church in Angel's Camp with half the town in attendance. Victoria wore a new dress she had made herself, white with blue trim, and she carried a bouquet of winter greenery. Jacob wore a new suit that Victoria had made for him, though he felt stiff and uncomfortable in it. But when he saw Victoria walking toward him down the aisle, all his discomfort vanished and there was only joy. They spent their wedding night at Victoria's house in town, then packed up her most essential belongings and rode to Jacob's cabin for the winter. Victoria kept her shop, hiring a young woman named Sarah to manage it during the week while she was at the cabin. Once a month, Jacob and Victoria would come down to town for a few days, so Victoria could check on the business and take new commissions. It was a good arrangement, though not without its challenges. The winter was hard, with snow piling up so deep that they could not get to town for almost 2 months. But Victoria adapted to mountain life better than Jacob had dared hope. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to preserve food, to help with the trapping. And she sewed, creating beautiful quilts and clothes and even teaching Jacob the basics of mending. "Why are you teaching me this?" Jacob asked one snowy afternoon as Victoria showed him how to do a proper seam. "Because you need to know how to take care of yourself," Victoria said. "What if something happens to me? You cannot go around with torn clothes." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Jacob said fiercely, pulling her close. But Victoria was right to insist, though not for the reasons either of them expected. The following spring, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult, with Victoria suffering from terrible sickness the first few months, and then swelling and fatigue in the later months. Jacob was terrified, suddenly aware of how isolated they were in the mountains, how far from a doctor. "We should go to town," he said when Victoria was 6 months along. "Stay there until after the baby comes." "I want to stay here," Victoria said stubbornly. "This is our home. Our baby should be born here." "What if something goes wrong?" Jacob demanded. "What if you need help?" "Then you will help me," Victoria said calmly. "You are the strongest, most capable man I know, and if we need a doctor, you can ride to town and bring one back." Jacob was not convinced, but Victoria refused to budge, so he did the only thing he could think of. He rode to town and found the doctor, an older man named Samuel Finch, and convinced him to come up to the cabin and check on Victoria. Doctor Finch made the trip, examined Victoria, and pronounced her healthy though definitely tired from carrying the baby. "She should be fine," Dr. Finch told Jacob, "but birth is unpredictable. If you want to be safe, bring her to town when her time gets close." Jacob relayed this to Victoria, who sighed but agreed. "1 month before the baby is due, we will go to town," she said. "But not before then." That month turned out to be both the longest and shortest of Jacob's life. He could not sleep, startling awake at every sound, checking on Victoria constantly. She found it both endearing and annoying, finally telling him that he needed to relax, or he would drive them both insane. "I am scared," Jacob admitted. "I never wanted to care about someone this much, because I knew it would mean being scared of losing them." Victoria took his face in her hands. "I am scared too. But I would rather have you and our baby and this life we are building, even with the fear, than go back to being alone and safe. Would not you?" "Yes," Jacob said. "God help me, yes." They made it to town 2 weeks before the baby was due, staying at Victoria's house. The birth happened on a warm June evening, with Dr. Finch and Mrs. Cooper attending. Jacob paced outside for hours, listening to Victoria's cries and feeling utterly helpless. When Dr. Finch finally came out and told him he had a son, Jacob nearly collapsed with relief. Victoria was exhausted but glowing when he went in to see her. She held their son, a red-faced, squalling bundle, and smiled up at Jacob. "Meet James," she said. "James Cooper Whitmore." Jacob took his son carefully, awed by how small and fragile he was. "James," he repeated. "Hello, James." The baby quieted at the sound of his voice, opening dark blue eyes that would eventually turn the same blue-gray as his father's. Jacob felt something shift in his world, an expansion he had not known was possible. He had thought loving Victoria had changed him, but this was different, this fierce, protective love for this tiny person who depended on them completely. They stayed in town for 2 months, letting Victoria recover and adjusting to life with a baby. When they finally returned to the cabin, it was with a wagon full of supplies and a cradle that Jacob had built himself, using skills he had learned from watching Victoria sew. He had measured and cut and joined the wood with the same care she used for her stitching, creating something sturdy and beautiful for their son. Life settled into a new rhythm. Victoria sewed when the baby slept, creating clothes for James and taking on commissions that she worked on at her own pace. Jacob adjusted his trapping schedule, staying closer to the cabin, always making sure he was back before dark. They were tired and sometimes overwhelmed, but they were happy. When James was 6 months old, Jacob came in from checking the traps to find Victoria sewing by the window, the baby asleep in the cradle beside her. She was mending one of Jacob's shirts, the needle flashing in and out of the fabric with practiced ease. "You have gotten good at that," she said without looking up. Jacob crossed to her and looked down at the shirt. She was right. The seam he had started was clumsy, but Victoria had shown him how to fix it, and he had done a decent job. I had a good teacher. Victoria smiled up at him. Do you remember that first dress I made from the fabric you bought? The blue one. How could I forget? Jacob said. You looked beautiful in it. I wore it the first time I told you I loved you, Victoria said, and I have saved it, even though it does not fit me anymore after having James. I thought maybe someday our daughter could wear it. Our daughter? Jacob asked, raising an eyebrow. Victoria laughed. Not yet, but someday maybe, if you want more children. I want whatever makes you happy, Jacob said, kneeling beside her chair. You and James are everything to me. We are happy, Victoria said, setting down her sewing to cup his face. We are so happy, Jacob. 2 years later they did have a daughter, born in the cabin with Mrs. Cooper and a midwife in attendance. They named her Clara, and she had Victoria's blonde hair and green eyes. James was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. By the time Clara was 2 and James was 4, they had settled into a comfortable life split between the mountains and town. Victoria's sewing business thrived, now with 2 employees running the shop full-time while she designed dresses and took special commissions. Jacob had expanded from just trapping to also running a small lumber operation, selling timber to the growing towns in the area. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were together. Jacob never forgot those early days, when he had first seen Victoria stumbling into town in her worn dress, or the way she had looked the first time she wore the blue dress he had bought fabric for. He kept a scrap of that blue fabric in his pocket, a reminder of the moment he had decided to act on the feelings he had been trying to deny. One evening, when the children were asleep and they were sitting by the fire in their cabin, Victoria asked him about that piece of fabric she had seen him carrying. "Why do you keep that?" she asked. Jacob ran his thumb over the worn fabric. "It reminds me of the moment I admitted to myself that I loved you. I was standing in the general store, looking at this fabric and thinking how beautiful it would look on you, and I realized I would do anything to make you happy. It scared me to death, feeling that much, but I could not deny it anymore." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I was so lost when I came here. I thought my life was over, that I would never have anything good again. And then you caught me when I was falling, literally and figuratively, and everything changed." "We caught each other," Jacob said, pulling her close. "I was just as lost as you were. I just did not know it until I met you." They sat together in the firelight, and Jacob thought about all the changes the past few years had brought. He had learned to sew, haltingly and without much grace, but well enough to mend a tear or replace a button. It was a small thing, but it represented something bigger. The way he had opened his life to let Victoria in, the way he had been willing to learn and change and grow. And Victoria had changed too, from the frightened, desperate woman in the worn dress to a confident mother and businesswoman who ran her own shop and raised their children, and still found time to create beautiful things with needle and thread. She had taught him that strength was not just about physical power or the ability to survive alone. It was also about letting people in, about building a life with someone else, about choosing love even when it was scary. Years passed, bringing more changes. James grew tall and strong like his father, while Clara inherited her mother's talent with a needle. They had one more child, another son they named Thomas, who was a perfect blend of both of them, with Jacob's build and Victoria's coloring. The cabin in the mountains expanded as the family grew, with Jacob adding rooms and Victoria making sure each space was warm and welcoming. The sewing shop in Angel's Camp became a landmark, known throughout the county for the quality of Victoria's work. And Jacob's lumber business grew steadily, providing a good living for his family, but through all the changes and growth, some things stayed the same. Every year on their anniversary, Jacob bought Victoria fabric for a new dress, always picking colors he thought would suit her. And every year, Victoria made the dress herself and wore it to a dance or church service. And Jacob would look at her with the same wonder he had felt that first time he saw her in the blue dress. And sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Victoria would take out that first blue dress, carefully preserved, and hold it up to the lamplight. She would trace the seams she had sewn with such care, remembering the joy she had felt creating something beautiful after years of having nothing. And she would thank God for the mountain man who had seen her when she was at her lowest and chosen to help without expecting anything in return, who had bought fabric and learned to sew and opened his heart to her. On a golden afternoon in September 1882, 15 years after Victoria had first stumbled into Angel's Camp, the family gathered in front of their cabin for a photograph. Jacob stood in the back, his hair now threaded with gray but his shoulders still broad and strong. Victoria stood beside him, wearing a dress of deep blue that brought out her still bright green eyes. James, now 17 and nearly as tall as his father, stood on Jacob's other side. Clara, at 13, stood beside her mother, already showing signs of the beauty she would become. And Thomas, at 8, sat in front, grinning widely. The photographer, who had traveled up from Sacramento, fussed with his equipment and told them all to hold still. Just before he took the photograph, Jacob reached down and took Victoria's hand, lacing his fingers through hers the way he had that first evening on Mrs. Cooper's porch. Victoria squeezed his hand and looked up at him with a smile that said everything words could not. They had built something beautiful together, she and this mountain man who had learned to sew for her. They had created a life full of love and laughter and hard work and simple joys. The photographer told them to smile, and they did, genuine smiles that came from deep happiness. The shutter clicked, capturing that moment forever, a family bound together by love and strengthened by the challenges they had overcome. That evening, after the photographer had packed up and left, and the children were doing their evening chores, Jacob and Victoria walked down to the creek behind the cabin. It was their favorite spot, where they had spent countless evenings talking and planning and simply being together. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked, sitting on the flat rock they thought of as theirs. "Giving up your shop to be here?" Victoria settled beside him, leaning against his solid warmth. "I did not give it up. I just changed how I do it. And no, I have never regretted anything about our life together. Have you? Do you miss the solitude you used to have?" "Not for a second," Jacob said firmly. "I thought I wanted to be alone, but I was just protecting myself from being hurt. You showed me that love is worth the risk." "You showed me that too," Victoria said. "When you bought that fabric for me, you were taking a risk. You did not know if I would accept it or be offended. You did not know if I felt the same way you did, but you did it anyway because you cared." "Best risk I ever took," Jacob said, kissing the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and purple. In the distance, they could hear their children laughing about something, their voices carrying on the evening air. "I have been thinking," Victoria said. "Clara has been asking to learn more about running the shop. She loves sewing and she is good at it, better than I was at her age." "She takes after her mother," Jacob said. "I thought maybe next year, when she turns 14, we could let her spend more time in town, learning the business side of things. Sarah is getting older and has been talking about retiring. Clara could eventually take over the shop if she wants to." Jacob considered this. He did not like the idea of Clara being away from them, but he knew Victoria was right. Their daughter needed to learn and grow to find her own path. If that is what she wants, We will make it work, just like we always have." "Just like we always have," Victoria echoed, smiling. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Mrs. Cooper passed away when Thomas was 10, and Victoria cried for the woman who had given her a chance when she had nothing. Martha Henderson retired and sold the general store to her son, but not before telling Victoria that she had known from the beginning that Jacob had been the one to buy the fabric. "I could see it in his eyes when he looked at you," Martha said. "That man was in love before he even knew what hit him." James grew up and fell in love with Sarah's daughter, a sweet girl named Emma who helped run Victoria's shop. They married when James was 21, and Victoria cried happy tears throughout the ceremony, remembering her own wedding day. Jacob walked Emma down the aisle since her father had passed away, and he felt honored to give his son such a wonderful bride. Clara did take over the shop, showing a head for business that surprised everyone. She expanded it, adding ready-made dresses alongside the custom work, and soon had 3 women working for her. She never married, declaring that she was perfectly happy running her business and did not need a husband to complete her. Thomas, the youngest, inherited his father's love of the mountains and his mother's artistic eye. He became a photographer, traveling throughout California capturing images of the changing landscape. But he always came home to the cabin, to the family that had raised him with love and laughter. Jacob and Victoria grew older together, their hair turning gray and then white, their bodies slowing down but their love never diminishing. They still held hands when they walked, still sat by the fire in the evenings talking about their day. And Victoria still sewed, though her fingers were not as nimble as they once had been, and Jacob still did small mending jobs, using the skills she had taught him all those years ago. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. James and Emma had 4 children now, ranging from 8 to 2. Clara came up from town with gifts for everyone. Thomas arrived with his camera, determined to capture every moment. Victoria wore a new dress that Jacob had bought fabric for, a soft lavender that complemented her white hair and still bright green eyes. Jacob wore a suit that Victoria had made for him, tailored to fit his still broad shoulders, though he had lost some of the bulk of his younger years. During dinner, James stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who showed me what real love looks like. My father learned to sew for my mother, which might not seem like much, but it showed him stepping outside his comfort zone to meet her where she was. And my mother learned to live in the mountains, to trap and hunt and survive in ways she never imagined, because she loved him enough to join his world. They built a life together by being willing to change and grow and meet each other halfway. That is what I hope to do with Emma every day of our marriage." Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. Jacob put his arm around her and pulled her close. "Happy tears?" he asked softly. "The happiest," she confirmed. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed and the cabin was quiet, Jacob and Victoria sat on their porch looking up at the stars. They had done this 1,000 times before, but it never got old. The peace and beauty of the mountains at night. "Do you remember the first time I brought you up here?" Jacob asked. "You were so nervous about riding on the horse." "I was terrified," Victoria admitted, "but I wanted to see your world to understand the life you loved, and the moment I saw this place I understood. It is beautiful here." "You made it beautiful," Jacob said. "Before you, it was just a place I lived. You made it a home." "We made it a home," Victoria corrected. "Together." Jacob turned to her and took both her hands in his. Even after 30 years, the sight of her hands in his still moved him. Those hands had created so many beautiful things, had sewed 1,000 dresses, had cared for their children, had held him through good times and bad. "I love you," he said. "More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "That is my line," Victoria said with a laugh, but her eyes were shining with tears. "I love you too, Jacob. Thank you for catching me when I was falling all those years ago." "Thank you for teaching me how to live," Jacob said. "Really live, not just survive." They sat together under the stars. Two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built a beautiful life through love and hard work and a willingness to learn from each other. The mountain man who had learned to sew, and the seamstress who had learned to love the mountains. Together, they had created something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and family and the courage to take risks for the people you care about. As the years went on, and they grew even older, their children worried about them living so far from town. But Jacob and Victoria refused to leave the cabin they had built together. This was their home, the place where they had raised their family and built their life, and they would stay here as long as they could. They were both in their 70s when Jacob fell ill. It was a hard winter, and he caught a fever that would not break. Victoria nursed him day and night, using all the herbs and remedies she had learned over the years, but nothing seemed to help. Finally, she sent Thomas riding through the snow to fetch the doctor from town. Dr. Finch, now an old man himself, made the difficult journey and examined Jacob. "His lungs are congested," he told Victoria privately. "At his age, with this kind of illness, it could go either way. All you can do is keep him warm and comfortable." Victoria refused to accept this. She sat by Jacob's bedside, bathing his forehead with cool cloths when the fever raged, piling blankets on him when he shook with chills, feeding him broth spoonful by spoonful when he had the strength to swallow. And she talked to him, reminding him of all the years they had shared, all the memories they had made. "You cannot leave me yet," she told him one night when the fever was particularly bad. "We have too much left to do. We have not seen all of Thomas's photographs from his last trip. We have not met James and Emma's new baby yet. Clara is talking about expanding the shop again, and she will need our advice. You have to get better, Jacob. I need you." Jacob's eyes flickered open, clouded with fever but still that beautiful blue-gray she loved. "Victoria," he whispered. "I am here," she said, taking his hand. "I am right here. Love you," he managed to say. "Always loved you." "I know," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too, so much. Please fight, Jacob. Please do not leave me." Whether it was Victoria's determination, the strength of Jacob's will, or simple luck, the fever finally broke on the 5th day. Jacob was weak and thin, but he was alive and improving. Victoria cried with relief and then scolded him for scaring her so badly. "I am sorry," Jacob said, his voice still hoarse, "but I am not ready to leave you yet. We have more memories to make." He was right. They had several more good years together, years filled with grandchildren and laughter and quiet evenings by the fire. Jacob grew stronger, though he never quite regained all his former strength. But he could still chop wood and check the traps and, most importantly, hold Victoria close at night. Victoria's fingers grew more arthritic, making sewing difficult, but she taught her granddaughters the craft she had mastered, passing on her skills and her love of creating beautiful things. And Jacob, who had learned to sew all those years ago to help his wife, now taught his grandsons the same skills, showing them that there was no shame in knowing how to mend your own clothes or create something useful with your hands. On a warm spring morning in 1897, 30 years after they had first met, Jacob and Victoria sat on their porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. They were both in their 80s now, their bodies worn by time and hard work, but their love was as strong as ever. "You have any regrets?" Victoria asked, as she had asked so many times over the years. Not a single one, Jacob said, as he always did. Except maybe that I waited so long to come back to town after I first met you. I wasted 6 weeks being scared when I could have been with you. We have had a good life, Victoria said contentedly. A very good life. The best life, Jacob agreed. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not know the first thing about love. You knew more than you thought, Victoria said. You knew how to see someone who was hurting and help them. You knew how to put someone else's needs before your own. You knew how to love, even if you did not call it that. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the mountains turn gold in the morning light. This was peace, Victoria thought. This was what she had been searching for all those years ago, when she had stumbled into Angel's camp with nothing but the worn dress on her back and a desperate hope for something better. She had found so much more than she had ever dreamed possible. She had found love and family and a home. She had found a man who would buy fabric and learn to sew just to make her happy, who would hold her hand through every challenge and celebrate every joy. She had found Jacob, and in finding him, she had found herself. Jacob looked at his wife, at the woman who had changed his entire life with her strength and grace and stubborn determination. He thought about the scared girl in the worn dress who had become a successful businesswoman, a loving mother, and the center of his world. He thought about all the dresses she had sewn over the years, all the beautiful things she had created, but none of them were as beautiful as the life they had built together. I love you, he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he had said them. I love you too, Victoria replied, squeezing his hand. Always and forever. They sat together as the sun rose fully over the mountains, two people who had found each other when they needed it most and had built a lifetime of love and memories together. The mountain man who had learned to sew, and the seamstress who had learned to love the mountains, together until the end. And years later, when their great-grandchildren asked about them, the stories would always begin the same way. She had been wearing the same dress for years, and then a mountain man bought fabric and learned to sew for her, and that was when their love story truly began.